Have you ever wondered if bacteria could talk to each other? Do bacteria communicate with each other like our cells communicate with each other? Well, in this podcast, we're going to get to the bottom of that. How do cells, including bacteria, communicate with each other? Let's get started. So when I think of how cells communicate, I like to reference the internet because, as we'll learn, cell-to-cell communication is essential for multicellular organisms. But we have billions of cells. How do they all communicate? So I call this the cellular internet. If you think of it like this, right? If you know how the internet works or a network works, basically you have computers that serve as little hubs, and then there's a connection to another computer. So if I'm here and I want some information from, I don't know, France, right? That's connected to a hub, which is connected to another hub, which is connected to a hub, and that access goes to me eventually by the way of several intermediary nodes or points. Well, cell communication can be similar, right? One cell can communicate with another cell, which then has to communicate with another cell. So there's this big organizational network of communication both within our cells and between cells. So communication involves a transduction of a signal from one cell or from an organism or from the environment. So this transduction really is just a fancy word for changing the signal, right, into something that the cell can understand. We'll go over that more in detail in a moment. So this is how cells communicate. Let me give you a little overview of the process. So cell communication, I've sort of broken down into cell communication for single-celled organisms and then for multicellular, right? Obviously, we are multicellular organisms, but at the beginning, I was asking about bacteria, some single-celled organisms. How do they communicate? Well, bacteria, single-celled organisms, it's mostly about environmental response, right? So you need to think sort of this chemical, environmental response that they need to react to. One example is quorum sensing. So if you know the word quorum, right, this just means, is there a quorum or is there a group available? So bacteria, prime example here you see is the bacteria Vibrio fischeri. They do some incredible quorum sensing. So if you're a bacteria, right, it might be a lonely world. You might be thinking, I'm the only bacteria around. So what they do is they send signals to see if or sense if there's a quorum, if there's enough of them to start to multiply, to grow, etc. So if it's just one bacteria, right, they may not invest the energy in growing, multiplying, dividing, doing this certain task. But if there's a quorum of them, they might, start replicating, create a biofilm, right? If you think about the bacteria that live on your teeth, right? They've created a sort of biofilm of bacteria. They've regenerated, they've multiplied because they sensed a quorum. And it's actually quite complicated. They release these chemical signals and then they detect them. And if there's a detection, they'll send other chemical signals out. And then all the bacteria will know and be able to communicate with each other that there is a quorum. So that's how a single-celled organism interacts, right? Yes, bacteria do communicate with each other. So what about multicellular organisms, right? We've got lots of different cells doing lots of different things. So our cells need to work together to coordinate activities. A prime example is if, I don't have enough, let's say, sugar, glucose in my blood, and I need to break down some glycogen, prime example. Now, as you can see here, this is a very complicated procedure, lots of chemicals, lots of feedback mechanisms, but the idea is your cells need to communicate with each other to coordinate what's going on in the body. Now, I'm going to give you several examples through the rest of this video of how cells communicate. So a signal transduction pathway, I mentioned this word earlier, is really just a series of steps where a signal, right, normally chemical signal, is received on the surface of a cell and then is converted into some response in the cell. So if you take, for example, here, right? So here's a cell wall or a cell membrane. Here's the inside of the cell. Embedded in our walls or membranes are these receptors. So the receptor might receive a stimulus. Now, if this was an animal cell, obviously it wouldn't be a cell wall, but it would be a cell membrane. But plant cells, you have to deal with cell walls, right? So if this was an animal cell and it was dealing with a hormone, the hormone acts as the messenger, binds to the receptor, and then the transduction part that we see here is all these steps that convert this signal that it received into some response that we need, okay? In my next video, I go through all the details specifically of the signal transduction pathway. I wanted to mention it here so you have a basic idea of this reception, transduction, and then response. That is why cells communicate, or how they communicate, through reception, transduction, and response. So the other thing I need to mention here is that if you look in both bacteria and multicellular organisms, these pathways for signal transduction are incredibly similar, which tends to support the idea, well, that makes sense, right? Evolution happened. We evolved from a common ancestor. So it makes sense that these pathways have been preserved through evolution if they work. So a few different types of signaling that we might encounter. So here's another little map I put together about how cells communicate. Some cells communicate directly. So one cell touches the other cell. We call that direct cell-to-cell contact. And in this plant cell here that you see, right, you see lots of plant cells here, they're actually touching each other. So if we zoom in between, right, where these cells are touching each other, there's something called a plasmodesmata. That is this opening, this exchange place where materials are allowed to transport between cells. So this is an example of how cells can communicate, right? They actually touch each other and then transmit things between cells. Our immune cells, we have some antigen presenter cells that actually touch helper T cells to present an antigen to them to alert them what's going on. So some cells communicate directly by contact. Another example would be when cells communicate over short distances. And the prime example that I listed earlier was quorum sensing in bacteria, right? Bacteria close to another bacteria, they send a little signal to each other. The other example you may have heard of is neurotransmitters between neurons. And that's what you sort of see here, right? You see the axon of one neuron, right? There's a neuron right there. And it's releasing some little neurotransmitter chemicals. They're going to go to either another neuron or a receptor cell to do some work. So this is a short distance, right? Very small distance between these two things. So we had no distance, direct contact. We have a short distance like we see there. And then, obviously, the other example would be over a longer distance, right? Still within the body, but a signal is released that travels down a long distance to a target cell. When we think of our endocrine system or hormones, those are generally long-distance cellular communicators. And as you can see right here, we've got some specific hormones being released from the pituitary. These happen to be thyroid-stimulating hormones. And what they're going to do is they're being released from the pituitary. They're going to go into the bloodstream, travel a long distance to get where they're going. Okay? So this is a general overview of the three types. And now I'm going to go into a little more in depth about each one. So the first one is the direct contact signaling, right? And I mentioned this with the plasmodesmata. So here we get a little closer view. You can see the little openings, the plasmodesmata between these plant cells, right? You see the membrane, and you see the openings here. So what you see is that there's this area where the plant cells can just send signals back and forth. So the cytoplasm is actually directly connected to the adjacent cells. So cells communicate by this cell-to-cell contact through these cellular junctions. In plants, we call it a plasmodesmata. In animal cells, I think they're called tight junctions, a few other words that can describe them in animal cells. But they're the same thing. It's a way that cells communicate because they're actually physically touching each other. If we go into a little more depth for short distance signaling, we've got a few different types I want to go over. Paracrine signaling is when one cell secretes molecules that act on nearby target cells. Remember, we're still short distance here, so they need to be nearby. Prime example is a growth factor. And here is sort of a diagram you can see of paracrine signaling. So we've got one cell here that's releasing. They're going to act to a neighboring cell, right? So what you can see here is we got a little chart that tells you what's happening. So in paracrine signaling, you see the signaling cell up here, right? It's sort of yellow. Here's the molecule, the signaling molecule, the chemical, that's going to go and find a receptor that will then activate some effector molecule in the cell so that we get some response. Now, what response are we getting? That depends, right? It could be, okay, we need some transcription to occur, right? Transcription, right? Taking DNA into RNA. That's often the response in the cell. Make this our messenger RNA to make a protein ultimately. Growth hormones, lots of things we could be wanting in a response from a cell. That's one example. So paracrine is nearby target cells. Synaptic signaling we specifically talk about in nerve cells because they're releasing neurotransmitters. And what these do, as you can see, right, once again, here's the axon from a neuron. And what's happening here is there's small space called the synapse between these neurons and between their effector cells. And once again, we've got our signaling cell. It releases the neurotransmitter that goes. The receptor gets activated, which then activates effector molecules and essentially gives us some response in the target cell. Now, these are both complicated, and we could give you lots of examples, but what you need to remember here is that short distance signaling can be paracrine or synaptic if we're talking about the small synapse space between these neurons. Then long distance signaling. So long distance signaling we think of again with the endocrine system and hormones, right? We think hormone, just think sort of like a chemical messenger. What happens? Endocrine signaling, these chemical messengers are released by a gland generally in the endocrine system, and they have to travel a long distance. Well, how do things get long distance in the body, or how do they go a long distance? They have to get into some bloodstream, right? So we've got a capillary here. Notice here that we've got the pituitary gland again I'm mentioning just for this example, right? There's the pituitary gland. It's releasing these hormones. The hormones will travel into the capillary, then into the other blood vessels, traveling down where they need to go to some distant cell. Once again, it will bind to a receptor molecule, go in and effect or have some effect on the cell and get some result done. So these target cells can be distant, right? This the example I used here was the thyroid stimulating hormone, right? And what we'll find is this is named correctly, right? It stimulates the thyroid then to release its hormone. You'll find that many of our hormones need to be activated by other hormones. So these are examples of some long distance signaling as well. Okay, so try to take it all in. Big ideas from this specific video were about how cells communicate. Whether it's one cell like a bacteria communicating with another single-celled organism like a bacteria, or it's in your body, multi-cells having to communicate with other cells, multicellular organisms, to get some work done in the body. The next video, we're going to look specifically at the pathway once we go from here to here, right? What's going on once the signal is received and that signal is transduced into an actual thing that the cell can do.